The man I called my husband for 25 years looked me in the eye and said, "I never loved you the way he did." That's when I knew. The scar on his left hand that I'd kissed 1,000 times, it was in the wrong place. The way he held his coffee cup, the way he laughed at my jokes, the way he touched me in the dark. It had all been an elaborate performance by someone who had murdered my real husband on our honeymoon and taken his place. For a quarter century, I'd been living with, sleeping with, and loving the man who killed the only person I'd ever truly wanted to marry. Before I share this heartbreaking story, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Queen of Scars, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support keeps these stories alive. My name is Isabel, and at 53 years old, I thought I knew the man I'd been married to since I was 28. I thought I knew his voice, his touch, his mannerisms, the way he moved through our home like it was his natural habitat. I thought I understood his moods, his silences, his sudden moments of guilt that would wash over him during quiet evenings when he thought I wasn't watching. What I didn't know was that Thomas Whitmore had been dead for 25 years, murdered by his identical twin brother Marcus on what was supposed to be the happiest trip of our lives. And Marcus had been living Thomas's life ever since, sleeping in Thomas's bed, raising Thomas's children, and pretending to love Thomas's wife while carrying the secret of his brother's death like a poison in his heart. The story begins in 1998, when I was 26 and working as a pediatric nurse at the Children's Hospital in Seattle. I met Thomas at a coffee shop near the hospital. He was an environmental scientist who just moved to the city to work for the Department of Ecology. He was quiet, thoughtful, with dark hair and intense green eyes that seemed to see straight through to my soul. Our courtship was gentle and romantic. Thomas would bring me wildflowers from his field research sites, write me long letters about his work protecting salmon habitats, and listen with genuine interest to my stories about the children I cared for in the hospital. He was everything I wanted in a partner: kind, intelligent, passionate about making the world better. But there was always something slightly mysterious about Thomas's family background. He rarely talked about his childhood, deflected questions about his parents, and seemed uncomfortable whenever I suggested visiting his hometown in rural Oregon. "It's complicated," he'd say when I pressed him about meeting his family. "My parents died when I was young, and I don't have much contact with the people I grew up with." The only family member Thomas ever mentioned was his twin brother Marcus, and even then, only briefly and with obvious pain. "We had a falling out years ago," Thomas told me when I asked about Marcus. "We were competitive about everything when we were younger. It got ugly. We haven't spoken in 5 years." I respected Thomas's privacy about his past, assuming that some families just weren't close, that some wounds took time to heal. I was so in love with the man I knew that I didn't push for details about the man he'd been before we met. Thomas proposed to me after 18 months of dating, on a hiking trail overlooking Puget Sound. The ring was simple but beautiful, and his proposal was everything I'd dreamed of: heartfelt, romantic, and full of promises about the life we'd build together. "I want to spend every day for the rest of my life making you happy," he said as he knelt on that mountain trail with Seattle spread out below us. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me, Isabel. I don't deserve you, but I'm going to spend forever trying to be worthy of your love." We married 6 months later in a small ceremony at a garden venue outside the city. Thomas had no family at the wedding. He claimed his estranged relatives wouldn't approve of our marriage, but my parents and sisters were there. Thomas charmed them all with his quiet intelligence and obvious devotion to me. For our honeymoon, Thomas planned a camping trip to Olympic National Park. He was passionate about wilderness areas and wanted to share that love with me, to show me the old-growth forests and pristine lakes that had inspired his career choice. "It'll be perfect," he said as we loaded our camping gear into his Toyota 4Runner. "Just you and me, and some of the most beautiful wilderness in the world. We'll hike during the day, camp under the stars, and I'll show you why I fell in love with this landscape." The first 3 days of our honeymoon were magical. We hiked through temperate rainforests that felt like cathedrals, swam in glacial lakes so clear you could see 20 feet down, and slept in our tent, listening to owls and the distant howl of wolves. Thomas was in his element in the wilderness, relaxed and happy in a way I'd never seen before. But on the 4th day, everything changed. We were camped at a remote site near Lake Ozette, miles from the nearest road. Thomas had gone fishing early that morning while I slept in, promising to bring back trout for breakfast. When I woke up around 8 a.m., he still wasn't back. By 10 a.m., I was worried. Thomas was an experienced outdoorsman who never took unnecessary risks, especially not when he was responsible for someone else's safety. I walked down to the lake where he'd gone fishing, calling his name and looking for any sign of where he might have gone. I found his fishing rod abandoned on the shore, his tackle box open beside it, and his hat floating in the shallow water near the bank. But no Thomas. I spent 2 hours searching the shoreline, calling his name until my voice was hoarse, looking for any trace of my husband. Finally, panicked and exhausted, I hiked back to our campsite to get help. That's where I found him. Thomas was sitting by our extinguished campfire, cleaning fish and humming to himself like nothing had happened. "Where were you?" I asked, relief flooding through me. "I found your hat in the lake, your fishing gear on the shore. I thought something terrible had happened." Thomas looked up at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Sorry, babe. I caught some fish upstream and got distracted cleaning them. I must have dropped my hat when I was washing up." His explanation made sense, but something felt off. Thomas never called me babe. He always used my full name, Isabel, or sometimes Belle, when he was being affectionate. And there was something different about his voice, a slightly different cadence that I couldn't quite identify. "Are you okay?" I asked. "You seem different." "Just tired," Thomas said, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. "Long morning of fishing. How about we cook these trout and then pack up? I'm ready to head home." We'd planned to stay for 2 more days, but I agreed to leave early. Thomas seemed anxious to get back to Seattle, distracted and edgy in a way that was completely unlike his usual calm demeanor. The drive home was mostly silent. Thomas, or the man I thought was Thomas, drove faster than usual, took routes I didn't recognize, and seemed to be concentrating intensely on something that had nothing to do with navigation. "Thomas," I said as we approached the city, "are you sure you're all right? You've barely spoken since this morning." He glanced at me briefly, and for just a moment, I saw something in his eyes that looked like grief or guilt. "I'm fine," he said, "just processing the honeymoon." It was intense. That night, in our apartment, Thomas made love to me with a desperation I'd never felt from him before. It was passionate but somehow impersonal, as if he were trying to convince himself of something rather than expressing love for me. Afterward, as we lay in bed, I studied his profile in the darkness. Something was different. Not dramatically, but in subtle ways that nagged at the edges of my consciousness. The way he breathed, the position he slept in, the fact that he hadn't said "I love you" when we finished making love. Something Thomas had done every single time we'd been intimate since our 3rd date. But I was 28 years old, deeply in love and eager to start my married life. I dismissed my uneasiness as post-honeymoon adjustment, the normal process of getting used to living with someone new. Over the following weeks, I noticed other small changes in Thomas's behavior. He seemed unfamiliar with our apartment, asking where I kept things he'd helped me organize. He couldn't remember the names of some of my colleagues he'd met multiple times. He started drinking coffee black instead of with cream and sugar. He began wearing his watch on his right wrist instead of his left. When I asked about these changes, Thomas always had reasonable explanations. The honeymoon had given him perspective on what was really important. He was trying to develop new habits. He'd decided to simplify his preferences. The explanations were plausible enough that I accepted them. But something deep in my subconscious remained troubled. 3 months after our honeymoon, I discovered I was pregnant with our first child. Thomas's reaction was strange. He seemed shocked, almost panicked, before recovering and expressing appropriate joy. "Are you sure?" he asked, his face pale. "Are you sure you want to—" "That we're ready for—" "Thomas, we talked about having children." "You said you wanted kids?" "I do," he said quickly. It's sooner than I expected." "But you're right. This is wonderful news. Our daughter Emma was born 9 months later, and Thomas was a devoted father from the moment she arrived. But there was something almost desperate about his attention to her, as if he were trying to prove something to himself about his capacity for love. As the years passed, Thomas seemed to settle into his role as husband and father, but there were always moments when he seemed like a stranger. He would look at photographs of our early relationship with confusion, as if he didn't remember the events they captured. He had no idea where we'd kept important documents or mementos from our courtship. He couldn't remember stories I'd told him about my childhood, stories that had once been part of our shared history. But he was a good husband and father. He supported my career, shared household responsibilities, and was patient and loving with Emma, and later with our son Jake, born 3 years after Emma. If something felt different about Thomas after our honeymoon, I convinced myself it was just the natural evolution of a relationship, the way people change and grow within a marriage. The first crack in my certainty came 12 years into our marriage. When Emma was 11 and Jake was 8, we were at a family reunion for my side of the family, and my uncle was showing old photographs from various family gatherings. One photo showed Thomas and me at my cousin's wedding, about 6 months before our own wedding. "Oh, look at this one," my aunt said, pointing to the photo. "Thomas looks so young here. And look at that scar on his hand. It's barely visible." I looked at the photograph, then at Thomas's left hand, where a thin white scar ran from his knuckle to his wrist. A scar he'd told me came from a childhood accident with a broken bottle. In the photograph, the scar was on his right hand. "That's weird," I said, showing the photo to Thomas. "The scar looks like it's on your right hand here, but it's on your left." Thomas glanced at the photo and shrugged. "Must be the way the camera flipped the image, or the angle or something. Old cameras did that sometimes." It was a plausible explanation, but it bothered me. I started paying more attention to details, collecting small inconsistencies that individually meant nothing, but together formed a pattern of strangeness. Thomas couldn't remember our first apartment's address, though we'd lived there for 3 years. He had no knowledge of a minor car accident he'd been in before we met. However, he'd told me about it during our early dating relationship. He didn't recognize songs that had been playing on the radio during our courtship, songs he'd once claimed were our music, most unsettling. He seemed to have no emotional connection to our early relationship. When I'd bring up sweet memories from our dating days, Thomas would smile and nod, but his eyes remained blank, as if I were telling him stories about strangers. The second major crack came 15 years into our marriage, when we visited a museum exhibit about Pacific Northwest ecology, exactly the kind of thing Thomas should have loved, given his career as an environmental scientist. "Look at this display about salmon habitat restoration," I said, pointing to a section that described the kind of work Thomas did professionally. "This is your area of expertise." Thomas studied the display for a long time, frowning. "Interesting," he said finally. "Interesting? Thomas, this is your life's work. You've spent 20 years protecting salmon runs." "Right," he said quickly. "It's interesting to see it presented this way, for the public," but his response felt rehearsed, like he was repeating information he'd memorized rather than discussing work he was passionate about. That night, I did something I'd never done before. I searched through Thomas's desk in our home office, looking for, I wasn't sure what, evidence, proof, something, to either confirm or dispel the growing certainty that something fundamental was wrong with my marriage. What I found was a folder hidden in the back of his filing cabinet, marked personal. Inside were documents I'd never seen before. Maps of Olympic National Park with specific locations marked in red ink. Newspaper clippings about missing persons cases and, most disturbing, a detailed timeline of our relationship written in handwriting that looked like Thomas's but somehow wasn't quite right. The timeline was eerily accurate, listing every major milestone in our relationship. Our first date, our first kiss, our engagement, our wedding. But it read like research notes rather than personal memories, as if someone had been studying our relationship rather than living it. At the bottom of the folder was a single photograph that made my blood run cold. It showed Thomas, or someone who looked exactly like Thomas, standing next to another man who was identical to him in every detail. They were both wearing hiking gear, both smiling at the camera, both looking young and happy. The photo was dated 2 months before I met Thomas. On the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize, someone had written, "Thomas and Marcus, Lake Ozette, final trip, Marcus." Thomas's twin brother, the one he'd claimed to be estranged from, the one he'd said he hadn't spoken to in 5 years before we met. I sat in Thomas's office until dawn, staring at that photograph and trying to make sense of what I'd found. Two possibilities existed. Either Thomas had lied to me about his relationship with his brother, or the man I'd been married to for 15 years wasn't Thomas at all. The thought was so insane, so impossible that I almost dismissed it immediately. People don't just disappear and get replaced by their identical twins. That was the stuff of psychological thrillers, not real life. But as I sat there in the early morning light, pieces of a horrifying puzzle began to fit together. Thomas's dramatic personality change after our honeymoon, his unfamiliarity with our shared history, his lack of emotional connection to our early relationship, the scar that had mysteriously moved from one hand to another. His professional knowledge seemed memorized rather than experienced, and the fishing gear abandoned on the shore of Lake Ozette, where the photograph showed both brothers had been just months before I met Thomas. I spent the next 3 days in a state of numb shock, watching the man I called my husband go about his daily routine. At the same time, I tried to process the possibility that I'd been living with an imposter for 15 years. I noticed things I'd been unconsciously dismissing for years. The way he held his coffee cup, with his left hand instead of his right, like a mirror image of the Thomas I'd fallen in love with. The fact that he was slightly better at math than Thomas had been, but couldn't remember historical dates that Thomas had been obsessed with. The way he kissed me, technically the same, but somehow different, like someone who'd learned the motions, but not the emotion behind them. On the 4th day, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to confront him directly. "Thomas," I said that evening after the children were in bed, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." He looked up from the book he was reading, a mystery novel, though the Thomas I'd married had preferred non-fiction, and gave me his full attention. "What is it, Belle?" Even the nickname felt wrong. Thomas had called me Belle occasionally, but not regularly, and never with the particular inflection this man used. "I found a photograph in your desk," I said, producing the image of the two identical men. "Of you and Marcus. The date says it was taken 2 months before we met." Thomas, or the man I'd been calling Thomas, went very still. I watched his face carefully, looking for any reaction that might give him away. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. "It was in a folder in your filing cabinet, along with timeline notes about our relationship and newspaper clippings about missing persons." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he set down his book and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not quite guilt, not quite grief, but something that encompassed both. "How long have you known?" he asked. The words hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't denying it. He wasn't asking what I meant or acting confused by my accusation. He was asking how long I'd known the truth. "Known what?" I whispered, though I already understood what he was going to tell me. "How long have you known that I'm not Thomas?" The world tilted around me. Even though I'd suspected, even though the evidence had been building for days, hearing him confirm my worst fear was devastating. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "I'm Marcus," he said, "Thomas's twin brother, and I've been living his life for 25 years. The room seemed to spin around me. 25 years. Our entire marriage, the birth of our children. Every anniversary, every birthday, every moment of intimacy we'd shared. Where is Thomas?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would destroy me. Marcus looked away, unable to meet my eyes. "Thomas is dead. I killed him on your honeymoon at Lake Ozette. It was an accident that became something else." I felt like I was drowning. The man I'd loved, the father of my children, the person I'd built my entire adult life around, had been dead for 25 years, and I'd been unknowingly living with his murderer. "Why?" I whispered. Marcus was quiet for so long, I thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was full of pain and guilt. "Because I was in love with you," he said. "I had been from the moment Thomas first brought you around. I loved you, and you chose him, and I couldn't stand it." The confession was like a knife in my chest. "So you killed your own brother?" "I followed you to Lake Ozette. I'd been watching you, studying your relationship, learning everything about Thomas so I could become him if I ever got the chance. When I saw him alone by the lake that morning, we fought. He fell and hit his head on a rock. At first I tried to save him, but then I realized this was my opportunity. Your opportunity to steal his life. My opportunity to be with you the way I'd always wanted to be. You were so perfect, Isabel. So kind and beautiful and good. Thomas didn't deserve you. He took you for granted, didn't appreciate how lucky he was. I stared at this man who looked exactly like my husband, but was a stranger. You've been lying to me for 25 years. Every day, every conversation, every time you touched me, it was all a lie. No, Marcus said desperately. The love was real. My love for you was real. Everything I felt for you, every moment of happiness we shared, that was genuine. But you're not Thomas. You killed Thomas and stole his identity. I became Thomas. I studied everything about him, learned his mannerisms, his preferences, his way of speaking. I loved you better than he ever could have. I was a better husband, a better father. I gave you a better life than Thomas would have. The arrogance of his statement was breathtaking. You don't get to decide that. You don't get to murder someone and then claim you were doing it for their own good. I never meant for Thomas to die, Marcus said. It was an accident that I turned into. Something else. But once it happened, once I had the chance to be with you, I couldn't give it up. I loved you too much. I looked at this man, this stranger, who had shared my bed for 25 years, who had held me during my father's funeral, who had been in the delivery room when our children were born, who had been my partner through every major moment of my adult life. Our children, I said suddenly. Emma and Jake. They're not Thomas's children. They're yours, Marcus nodded. They're our children. We raised them together. We love them together. That part is real, Isabel. Whatever else I've done wrong, our children are real, and our love for them is real. I felt like I was having a mental breakdown. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, my family, had been built on the foundation of murder and deception. I need you to leave, I said quietly. Isabel, I need you to leave this house right now before I call the police. Marcus stood up slowly, his face pale. What are you going to do? I don't know anything anymore, but I can't look at you right now without seeing a killer. I can't be in the same room with someone who murdered the man I loved and then pretended to be him for 25 years. The man you loved is standing right here, Marcus said desperately. I'm the one who held you when you cried. I'm the one who celebrated when Emma took her first steps. I'm the one who stayed up all night with Jake when he had pneumonia. I'm the one who's loved you every single day for 25 years. You're the one who killed my husband and stole his life, I replied. You're a murderer who's been lying to me for a quarter century. Marcus gathered a few things and left that night. After he was gone, I sat in our living room. The room we decorated together, filled with 25 years of family photos and memories that now felt like evidence of an elaborate fraud, and tried to figure out what to do next. The first person I called was my sister Jennifer, who came over immediately and held me. At the same time, I sobbed and told her the impossible story of how my entire married life had been a lie. We have to call the police, Jennifer said. Isabella, this man is a murderer. He killed Thomas and has been impersonating him for decades. But what about Emma and Jake? What about our children? They don't know their father is actually their uncle, that their real father died before they were born. How do I tell them that? The man who raised them is a killer? It was the question that would torment me for months. Emma was 24, just starting her career as a teacher. Jake was 21, finishing college. They loved their father, the man they thought was their father, and had no idea their entire family history was built on murder and deception. I hired a private investigator to help me gather evidence before going to the police. What we found was a trail of methodical identity theft that spanned 25 years. After killing Thomas at Lake Ozette, Marcus had disposed of his brother's body in a way that it would never be found, then spent weeks studying Thomas's life, his habits, his relationships, and his professional knowledge. He'd practiced Thomas's handwriting, memorized details about Thomas's childhood, even learned to mimic his brother's physical mannerisms. The transformation hadn't been perfect, which explained all the small inconsistencies I'd noticed over the years. But it had been thorough enough to fool a woman in love who had no reason to suspect her husband was an imposter. Marcus had been living under Thomas's social security number, using Thomas's educational credentials, even filing taxes as Thomas Whitmore for 25 years. It was one of the most elaborate cases of identity theft the investigators had ever seen. 6 weeks after Marcus's confession, I finally found the courage to call the police. Detective Sarah Connolly listened to my story with professional calm. Still, I could see the shock in her eyes as I explained how I'd discovered my husband was actually his twin brother, a murderer who'd been impersonating his victim for 25 years. "This is unprecedented," Detective Connolly said. "We'll need to open a homicide investigation for Thomas Whitmore's death, even though it happened 25 years ago. And we'll need to investigate Marcus Whitmore for murder, identity theft, fraud, and a dozen other crimes." The hardest part was telling Emma and Jake. I gathered my children in our living room on a Saturday afternoon. I tried to find words for something that had no precedent, no gentle way to explain it. "I need to tell you something about your father," I began. "Something that's going to be very difficult to understand." Emma looked worried immediately. "Is Dad okay? Is he sick? Your father, the man you know as your father, is not actually Thomas Whitmore. He's Thomas's identical twin brother, Marcus. 25 years ago, Marcus killed Thomas and took his place in our family." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma and Jake stared at me like I was having a psychotic break. "Mom," Jake said carefully, "that's impossible. Dad is Dad. He's been our father our entire lives." "I know how it sounds," I said, showing them the photograph of Thomas and Marcus together. "But it's true. The man who raised you is actually your uncle, and your real father died before either of you was born." Emma started crying. "You're saying Dad is a murderer?" "I'm saying the man we all thought was your father killed his brother and stole his identity. He's been living Thomas's life for 25 years. It took months of family therapy for Emma and Jake to begin processing the truth about their parentage and family history. They struggled with loving the man who had raised them while grappling with the knowledge that he was a murderer who had built their family on deception. "He was a good father to us," Emma said during one particularly difficult therapy session. "Even if he was lying about who he loved us and took care of us." "How do I reconcile that with the fact that he killed someone?" "You don't have to reconcile it," our therapist said. "You can acknowledge that Marcus provided good parenting while also acknowledging that his actions were wrong. Love and criminality can coexist in complicated ways. Marcus was arrested 8 months after he confessed to me. The murder charges were complicated by the passage of time, but the identity theft and fraud charges were solid. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter in Thomas's death, claiming it had been an accident during a fight. However, the premeditated nature of the identity theft suggested otherwise. During his sentencing hearing, Marcus was allowed to make a statement. He used the opportunity to address me and our children directly. "Isabel," he said, looking at me across the courtroom, "I know you'll never forgive me for what I've done. I know I destroyed your life and our children's sense of security. But I need you to know that every day I spent as your husband was the happiest day of my life. I loved you more than Thomas ever could have. And I loved Emma and Jake like they were my own children, because they are my own children." He turned to Emma and Jake, both of whom had come to the hearing despite their conflicted feelings about him. "I know I can never undo the lies I've told or give you back the father you thought you had. But please know that every moment I spent raising you was genuine. My love for you was real, even if everything else was false." Marcus was sentenced to 20 years in prison for manslaughter and identity theft. He was 68 years old. He would likely die in prison. After his sentencing, I began the long process of rebuilding my life and identity. For 25 years, I'd been Mrs. Thomas Whitmore, wife and mother, defined by relationships that I now knew had been built on murder and deception. At 53, I had to learn who Isabel Patterson was when she wasn't married to a dead man's impersonator. I changed my name back to my maiden name and moved to Portland, where I could start fresh without the constant reminders of my fraudulent marriage. Emma and Jake struggled with their own identity issues. They had been raised as Whitmores. Still, their father wasn't actually a Whitmore, and their real father was a man they'd never known. Do we keep Dad's last name, even though it's not really ours? Jake asked me during one of our regular phone calls. Do we change it to Mom's maiden name? Do we try to find out what Thomas's middle name was and honor him somehow? These were questions that had no easy answers, complications that arose from living with an imposter for 25 years. 2 years after Marcus's imprisonment, I received a letter from him. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. In the letter, Marcus wrote about his life in prison, his regret for the choices he'd made, and his love for the family he'd destroyed through his deception. I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, he wrote, but I want you to know that if I could go back and change what happened at Lake Ozette, I would. Not because I regret the 25 years I spent with you, those were the best years of my life, but because you deserve to have those 25 years with Thomas, the man you actually chose to marry. I stole that from you, and I stole Thomas's life, and I'll spend whatever time I have left in prison knowing that my selfishness destroyed multiple lives. But I will never regret loving you, even though that love led me to do terrible things. I read the letter once, then burned it. Some apologies come too late, and some crimes are too complete to forgive. Marcus died in prison 3 years into his sentence, of a heart attack brought on by years of guilt and the stress of living a lie. When the prison contacted me about his death, I felt empty. Not sad, not relieved, just hollow. The man I'd loved was Thomas, and Thomas had been dead for 28 years. The man who had raised my children and shared my bed for 25 years was a stranger whose love had been built on murder and deception. Today, I'm 58 years old and living a quiet life in Portland. Emma and Jake are both married now, with children of their own. And we've all learned to live with the complicated legacy of our family history. Sometimes Emma's daughter will ask about her grandfather, and Emma struggles to explain that the man in all the family photos was actually her great-uncle. This man killed his brother and stole his life. It's not the kind of family history you can easily summarize for a 5-year-old. I never remarried. After 25 years of unknowingly living with a murderer, my ability to trust my own judgment about people was shattered. How do you open your heart to someone new when you spent a quarter-century completely wrong about the person sleeping next to you? But I've found peace in smaller things. My garden, my volunteer work at the Children's Hospital, my relationships with Emma and Jake and their families. I've learned to live with the knowledge that love and deception can coexist, that someone can genuinely care for you while destroying your life, that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who claim to love you most. The man I called my husband for 25 years pretended to be Thomas Whitmore, but he could never actually become him. Thomas was gentle where Marcus was desperate, confident where Marcus was insecure, and honest where Marcus was deceptive. Marcus thought he could murder his brother and steal his life, that love justified any crime, and that the result mattered more than the methods used to achieve it. He was wrong on all counts. Thomas died at 28, on what should have been the happiest week of his life, killed by the brother he'd trusted and loved. He never got to see his children born, never got to build the career he'd dreamed of, never got to grow old with the woman he'd chosen to marry. That's the real tragedy of this story. Not that I was deceived, but that Thomas was murdered just as his life was beginning. Marcus didn't just steal 25 years from me. He stole an entire lifetime from his brother. Some stories end with justice served and families healed. This story ends with the knowledge that some crimes are too complex for simple resolution, that some deceptions run too deep for easy recovery. But it also ends with survival. I survived 25 years of unknowingly living with my husband's killer. Emma and Jake survived learning that their father was actually their uncle and a murderer. We all survived the destruction of everything we thought we knew about our family, and perhaps that's enough. Perhaps survival, in the face of unimaginable betrayal, is its own form of victory. Marcus thought he could kill Thomas and become him. That identity was something that could be stolen and worn like a costume. He spent 25 years trying to be someone he wasn't, and in the end, the lies consumed him. Thomas may have died at 28, but his identity remained intact. He was who he was, kind, gentle, honest, and no amount of impersonation could change that. As for me, at 58, I'm finally learning who Isabel Patterson is when she's not defined by the men in her life, when she's not trying to love a ghost or forgive a killer, and for the first time in 25 years, that feels like enough.